Good morning, my name is Rebecca Bardsley and I'm doing a presentation on the perspectives of psychology. What is behaviourism? The beginnings of behaviourism was first discovered by Ivan Pavlov in 1897. Pavlov was a Russian physiologist who discovered classical conditioning through another experiment. He was conducting an experiment on dogs' digestive system, where Pavlov noted that the dogs salivated when presented with food. Pavlov's dog experiment is widely known in the psychology field. When Pavlov noticed a dog's reaction to food, he came up with the idea of introducing a neutral stimulus to see if he could elicit the same response without food. So every time the dogs were presented food, he rang a bell. The dogs then started to expect food every time the bell rang, which caused the dogs to salivate. He then started to ring the bell with no presentation of food to see if he could cause the dogs to salivate. The dogs did react and salivate without food, and therefore Pavlov's experiment was a success. Pavlov's experiment helped make advancements in the psychology field. Classical conditioning. Classical conditioning, also referred to Pavlovian conditioning, is neutral stimulus, which refers to an item or action that causes no response or reaction from the subject. Unconditioned stimulus is an item or action that naturally elicits a response or reaction from the subject. This is not a reaction that is learned or taught. Conditioned stimulus is a previously neutral item or action that now elicits a response or reaction. This is an item or action that has been taught to cause a reaction. Conditioned response is a taught response to a conditioned stimulus. This is where they now react to a neutral stimulus as the subject has been taught to react. An unconditioned response. This is an automatic response to an unconditioned stimulus. This has not been taught or learnt. Pavlov's discovery. He discovered temporal contiguity. The law of temporal contiguity was discovered when Pavlov realised that if too much time passed between the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus, association or learning will not happen. Unconditioning through experimental extinction. Through the experiment, it was realised that if the bell was rang without the food, the salivation response was weakening and eventually disappeared. This is when the conditioned stimulus was repeatedly used without the unconditioned stimulus being present. Spontaneous recovery. This is where a response that was thought to have disappeared makes a brief reappearance. Though the reaction may have faded, it is not completely forgotten. And generalization. This was discovered, and some sounds similar to that of a bell would cause a reaction from the dogs. Though not as strong as the reaction would be from using a bell, there are still similar responses. John Watson and Rosalie Rayner experiment. John Watson and Rosalie Rayner's experiments were highly controversial and frowned upon in the psychology world. Even though they did make an impact on the understanding of how conditioning worked, it was because their experiment was conducted on a small child, which brought to light the unethical and immoral standards of their experiment. Watson and Rayner had the mother's permission to conduct the experiment on the child, named Little Albert. They wanted to test if the phobias are a natural response or if little Albert can be conditioned to have phobias. Also, they wanted to see if conditioning is restricted to animals and if conditioning can be used on human subjects. Albert was presented with an array of animals, but was particularly drawn to the white rat, as he had no fear towards the rat. That was the baseline. The positive stimulus was therefore the white rat. Albert disliked or feared loud noises, so this was to be the negative stimulus to be used in the conditioning. After the baseline was recorded, they began the conditioning sessions when they presented the rat to Albert on 7 occasions, followed by the loud noise. he would react with fear and shying away. After the final conditioning, they presented the rat with no loud noise, and Albert would immediately burst into tears and try to crawl away, thus instilling fear of the rat, which led to Watson and Rayner's conclusion that this was evidence of fear conditioning. Watson and Rayner conducted these experiments to test out Pavlov's conditioning theory and to see if it also applied to humans. Besides discovering that Pavlov's theory does indeed also apply to humans as well as dogs, it also proved the generalization theory and extinction theory. So if Albert was to see anything that resembled or held aspects similar to that of the white rat, he would react negatively, proving generalization. For the extinction theory, Albert showed to have less of a reaction when presented with white rats or animals with similarities to that of the rat. They would have to freshen up his fear reactions by keeping on top of his conditioning. His mother pulled Albert from the experiment before they complete their full findings. What they wanted to test was if they could reverse the effects of conditioning. B.F. Skinner. Skinner developed the operant theory, where he studies positive and negative reinforcement. He believed that positive behaviours that were rewarded would be repeated, whilst negative behaviours were punished. They would not be repeated. He also created the Skinner box to study live organisms' behaviours. The box had two levers, one for food and another would give an electric shock. He also believed that you can teach good behaviour to organisms he studied. Skinner came up with the idea of reinforcement schedules: a fixed ratio, variable ratio, fixed interval, and variable interval. He found that the variable ratio was the most productive and less likely to be forgotten. Considered the father of behaviourism, the consequences of behaviour will determine if it happens again. Operant conditioning is the reinforcement of positive behaviour and negative behaviour. Skinner used mice and other small animals in his experiment to see if he could train these specimens by reinforcing these behaviours with rewards. Negative behaviour isn't reinforced through punishment. It is instead reinforced through removing the object that has caused this unpleasant behaviour. Skinner believes that such training could also be used on children, but others worried that this would only cause shallow learning rather than a deep understanding of a subject. Other psychologists worried that Skinner's theories were an oversimplification of behaviours, but Skinner managed to calm their worries by saying that positive reinforcement should only be used when rewarding effort and not necessarily the result. Also, positive reinforcement shouldn't be used all the time, as some children may not respond to positive reinforcement. This is when negative reinforcement will be needed to be used. The reward system from using positive reinforcement is not meant to be a long-term solution, but a learning aid in how to learn positive behaviours and train out bad behaviours. Assumptions of behaviourism in psychology. It is believed that we are all born as blank slates, and that it's our environment that teaches us how to behave, that all behaviour can be taught, and that inherited traits can be overwritten, that environmental factors affect our behaviours, that humans can be conditioned like animals, that to study behaviour, science-based experiments should be performed to measure responses more accurately. What is biological psychology? Biopsychology. Before biopsychology was first studied, it was philosophers that got people wondering about how the mind and body work together, how the mind affects the body. Aristotle, Hippocrates, and Plato were the first to think of how the heart affects the mind, and also where the mind is located. This spurred on the study of how the brain can affect the physiology of the body. It was René Descartes and Leonardo da Vinci that first thought of how the nervous system can affect the muscle responses. Phrenology, as pseudoscience, brought forth the idea that bumps on the skull affects parts of the brain. This helped bring the study of the brain into modern science. Each of the different lobes of the brain are responsible for different functions within the body. The nervous system is a big part of what connects the brain to the body and helps send signals throughout. The brain is also made up of neurotransmitters that carry information to neurons and send chemical messages throughout the body. Chemicals such as dopamine that can be responsible for Parkinson's disease or psychological disorders such as schizophrenia. Donald Hebb was an influential figure of neuropsychology in the 20th century. His research has helped the development of neuroscience as well as helping to be a founder of psychobiology. He became interested in psychology when he attended McGill University, where he met Sigmund Freud and Karl Lashley. He studied a master's degree in psychology. His thesis was about the perception of brightness and sizes of rats and the correlation between the two. Later on, in Hebb's career, he would work as a research assistant to neurosurgeon Wilder G. Penfield, who was studying nerve damage in patients with brain injuries. He would then move on to studying behaviour in primates with Lashley. After spending 5 years with Lashley, he would return home to write the famous works, The Organisation of Behaviour, 1948. This book contains his research on emotions, memory, thinking and perception. It is a study of human and animals' behaviour through biology and discusses how their behaviour is attributed to brain activity and biology. Hebb's theories resulted from observations and clinical studies. Behaviourists are fully against Hebb's theories as it goes against their own ideas. Assumptions of biopsychology. Genes determine our behaviour. The brain functions are localized. Neurochemicals are the basis of behaviour. Animals and humans are similar, therefore research can be conducted on both. Biopsychologists state that psychology should be seen and treated as a science. How we think or how we behave is linked to our biology and genes. How we behave can be inherited. Nature versus nurture. There is an ongoing argument between psychologists about nature versus nurture. There are those psychologists that believe that it's down to our genes that decide on our innate behaviour, that it's a part of evolution, so therefore our instincts and behaviours are passed down from our parents. There are also some genetic diseases that can affect a person's behaviour, such as Alzheimer's, that can alter a person's personality later on in life. There's also proof that nurture, the environment that a person grows up in, can affect a person's personality and behaviour. If a child is brought up in a violent environment, the child is more likely to have violent tendencies. If the same child was brought up to say his please and thank yous in a more modest background, they are more likely to have a more genteel behaviour. But I believe it is a combination of both, nature versus nurture, that can affect a child's personality as it grows up. The similarities of biopsychology and behaviourist. Behaviorism and biopsychologists both study psychology using a scientific method. The results from both studies have had positive impacts on psychology as well as drug therapy. Only relies on the scientific side and ignores the internal mental processes. Differences. Studies on behaviorism relies heavily on animal experiments and human anatomies are different. Behaviorism studies conditioning and nurturing of a subject, whilst biopsychology studies genetics and biology. Behaviorism takes into consideration the changing surroundings of its subjects. Biopsychology is focused solely on the study and development of the human brain, doesn't take into consideration mental processes. Application to contemporary issues. The application of behaviorism has helped with contemporary issues within the mental health sector by using conditioning in a therapy setting. A psychologist can help to reduce a patient's fear or phobia. Conditioning has also had a positive impact on treating a patient's addiction. Behaviorism isn't a foolproof treatment that has a 100% success rate, but it is a tool to be used in helping treat patients. Consistent reapplication of conditioning treatment will help to refresh the effects that conditioning treatment have. Behaviorism has also helped highlight other mental health issues such as anxiety and depression, helping patients to adopt healthier lifestyles that will help with their mental health issues. The application of behaviorism has been effective in the workplace and education because it rewards its employees, faculties, or students. By rewarding those, they adopt a more positive mindset and work ethic. The negative side is that it can become an expectation that if they stop receiving rewards, their reward ethic can deteriorate and slow down progress. Application to contemporary issues, biopsychology. Computed axial tomography scans are detailed images of the brain that look at any abnormalities or injuries to the brain, which can affect the mental health of a patient. These images help identify any changes that can contribute to psychological symptoms. Electroencephalograms monitor electrical signals in the brain. It's a non-invasive application that can detect changes to a patient's brainwaves and look at different patterns caused by different mental health conditions. Positron emission tomography measure metabolic processes from using medication and stimuli in therapeutic interventions. By using any one of these scans, we can study the patient's brain to understand what has caused a change to a patient's behaviour. It could be a genetic disorder or an imbalance of hormones, abnormalities such as tumour, or an injury such as a concussion. Thank you very much for listening to my presentation today. Thank you. Bye.